Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're digging into New York City, but not just the usual facts and figures.
Right.
We're looking at its bones, really, the stories in its buildings, its streets, using insights from Magnetic City, a walking companion to New York.
It's a great lens to view the city through.
Exactly. And we know you want the core insights, without getting lost in the weeds. So our goal here is to pull out the really fascinating stuff, the things that might change how you see NYC, but keep it focused.
Absolutely. And this approach, looking at the physical city, it tells you so much about its money, how the waterfront keeps changing, the hidden infrastructure.
Special dynamics, too, right?
Yeah, and the constant conversation between old and new. So our mission, if you like, is to unpack what makes it this magnetic city, understand the hidden stories in its shape.
Okay, let's jump right in then. This idea of the city's ever-changing skin. The book starts off saying that post 9/11, maybe especially during the Bloomberg era, New York got this kind of fresh glow. What did that actually mean on the ground?
Well, quite noticeable, apparently. A real visual shift. The author points to things like a big drop in graffiti, Central Park lawns looking much more manicured, cigarette smoke everywhere, lots of new trees being planted. And architecturally, you saw this trend replacing older stone buildings, sometimes darker ones, with these sleek glass facades.
Right, like a city getting a makeover. Very
Right.
modern, clean look.
Yeah, it created this feeling of constant renewal almost,
Yeah.
a city putting on a fresh face.
But the book hints this shiny surface maybe wasn't the whole picture.
Exactly, because underneath that gleam, you've still got the city's actual bones. The aging infrastructure we're talking,
The-
century-old subway tunnels, water mains, gas
The
lines.
stuff you don't see until it breaks.
Precisely. And those systems would, occasionally burst through the surface, quite literally sometimes, reminding everyone of the city's real age.
So, a modern polish on an old foundation. But was it just polish? The author suggests there was something more substantial happening too, right?
Yes, definitely. And that's key. This sheen wasn't just cosmetic. It coincided with some pretty fundamental shifts. Crime rates were falling significantly.
Okay.
The crack epidemic was receding. And importantly, you started seeing more middle-class families deciding to stay in the city, raise their kids there. That wasn't always the case.
So real demographic shifts underpinning the visual changes, a sense of stability returning.
Yeah, a feeling that the city was sort of regaining its confidence, its equilibrium.
Okay, let's shift downtown now, the financial district. That link between the rivers and the city's wealth seems fundamental.
Oh, absolutely. It's a constant theme. The waterfront wasn't just scenery, it was the engine. The book even mentions Battery Park City.
Right, built on landfill.
Exactly. Hudson River Landfill, back in the late 60s. It was directly linked to the planning for the World Trade Center, intended partly as housing for the financial district workforce.
And look at it now.
Totally transformed. A really desirable residential neighborhood right on the water. It shows how engineered land can take on a life of its own.
And the buildings themselves down there, they almost narrate the story of trade, don't they? Like the Merchants Exchange.
That's a perfect example.
Mm-hmm.
After the Great Fire wiped out the previous one, they rebuilt it in 1842-55 Wall Street. That neoclassical design, those huge columns,
Yeah.
it was a statement
A statement about what?
about stability, about moving past what the book calls the grubby bazaar phase of early trade. This was, commerce becoming institutionalized, powerful, respectable. The architecture had to reflect that.
And it's still there, even as finance has shapeshifted around it. You've got places like India House, too, a modern club in the old Cotton Exchange. The function changes, but the location, the connection to commerce, persists.
It does. And think bigger picture.
Yeah.
The port was crucial for the whole country's finances through import duties. That's why you get these increasingly grand customs houses.
Like the one at Bowling Green.
Cass Gilbert's Beaux-Arts masterpiece, yeah. Completed in 1907. These weren't just offices. They were projecting New York's power onto the world stage. Symbols of enormous wealth flowing through the city.
The book doesn't shy away from the sharper edges either, talking about rapacious capitalism, finding expression in buildings like the Cunard Building from 1921.
The Cunard Building really captured the glamour and maybe the excess of that transatlantic travel era. The old ticketing hall, which is now, I think, a condo lobby.
Right.
It was designed like a cathedral, frescoes, grandeur everywhere. It was selling a dream, an incredibly opulent vision of global connection and commerce.
A very different vibe from, say, 23 Wall Street, the old J.P. Morgan building across the way. The book calls it squat forbidding.
That contrast is stark, isn't it? the nerve center of finance for so long. And then years later, Philippe Starck comes in and reimagines it, and the building next door, 15 Broad, as these luxury
Well, the
condos.
smart tribe, as he called them.
Right. His goal, he said, was to bring happiness, respect, vision, poetry, all these rather unexpected qualities into the heart of Wall Street, a place he famously found both central and, well, hellish.
Injecting surrealism into high finance? It's quite a concept. And nearby, those visible scars on the stone from the 1920 Wall Street bombing.
A chilling reminder, yeah. Still there. Physical evidence of the tensions that have always existed alongside the wealth creation.
It's amazing how those marks endure. And the book mentions a former Morgan building rooftop being turned into a poolside garden for one of Stark's projects.
Talk about juxtaposition. Luxury leisure, literally overlooking the stock exchange. It captures that surreal blend of history, wealth, and modern transformation.
It all seems to come back to that intersection, Wall and Broad. The physical form changes constantly, but that core energy, that drive.
It seems constant, doesn't it? From New Amsterdam trading furs to today's global finance.
Yeah.
That same relentless pursuit, reshaping the oldest part of the city again and again.
Okay, let's move uptown slightly, thinking about the streets themselves. The book brings in Walt Whitman's view of the older, maybe wilder Manhattan streets.
You know, Whitman really embraced the chaos, didn't he? The irregular paths, the energy, the sheer unpredictability of it all. He saw it as this vital theater.
But then came the spirit of improvement.
Ah, yes. Which led directly to the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, the grid.
Imposing order above 14th Street? Sounds like a massive, maybe even brutal change.
Oh, it was hugely disruptive. Well, I have to imagine it basically wiped the slate clean north of 14th. It rolled over existing farm streams, workshops, paths, even small villages, all gone, replaced by this relentless, rational grid designed for efficient development.
And parks weren't even part of the original plan.
No, not initially. The thinking was, well, everyone has access to the rivers, the waterfront. That's your open space, your recreation. Plenty of fresh air there.
An idea that seems slightly bonkers now.
Right. It took time and, frankly, pressure from wealthier citizens who wanted amenities like London or Paris had to realize that dedicated parks within the grid were essential. Hence, eventually, Central Park.
So you had this rigid plan overlaid onto a messy, growing city, which created friction, like around Astor Place.
Yeah, Astor Place became this kind of flashpoint. You had the attempt to create this refined, exclusive space with the Astor Opera House, clashing directly with the rougher, working-class realities of the surrounding area, different worlds colliding.
And the streets themselves, because New York lacks that single big central square, they became the stage.
Exactly. A movable platform, as the book puts it, for everything. Celebrations, protests, parades. Think about the big Labor Day marches, ticker tape parades for heroes.
Vietnam protests.
Occupy Wall Street taking over Zuccotti Park. New Yorkers use the streets because, well, where else can such large-scale public expression happen in the same way?
And the book suggests this decentralized nature, this use of streets, kind of reflects core New York values like churn, diversity.
And maybe a resistance to being easily, corralled or homogenized. It's different from cities with huge central plazas, often used by regimes to project power or control crowds.
Right, those spaces can feel very top-down.
Whereas New York's street energy feels more bottom-up, more dispersed, harder to dominate completely. The streets belong to everyone, in a way.
Okay, let's talk traffic. Nobody enjoys it, but the book argues it's weirdly fundamental to the New York experience.
It's true, isn't it? We complain endlessly, but when the streets go silent, it feels wrong, unsettling. That constant background noise, sirens, horns, brakes, it's part of the city's pulse. Like electric light must have seemed revolutionary at first. Now it's just there, expected.
But things are changing. This pedestrian revolution the book mentions, people taking back the asphalt bit by bit.
Yeah, and it's often been incremental, hasn't it? A new plaza here, wider sidewalks there, maybe some planters blocking off a lane.
Like the Broadway plazas, Times Square, Herald Square.
Exactly. Suddenly there's space carved out just for people, right in the middle of everything. You see bikes, benches.
Yeah.
It's a different way of using that space.
And this came from thinking about streets differently, right? People like Jeanette Sadiq Khan, Polly Trottenberg, treating the street holistically.
Yes, that was the key idea. Recognizing it's not just a road for cars. It's got complex systems underneath water, power, transit, and complex life on top. Sidewalks aren't just for walking. They're for vendors, cafes, waiting, talking.
So the changes tried to account for all that.
Right. Wider sidewalks where possible, rules for sidewalk cafes, better accessibility, making the public realm genuinely serve the public in all its diversity.
Now, the waterfront, a huge topic. The image we have now of parks and recreation is so different from the past. The book paints quite a picture.
Oh, it sounds incredible. Intense. A
Wow.
frightening, chaotic, and thrilling strip, I think it says. The smells alone, coffee, coal, spices, horse dung. Imagine.
Just crammed with activity.
Absolutely. Logs floating, grain elevators towering, carts everywhere, longshoremen hauling goods, warehouses overflowing with stuff from all over the world, ships packed so tightly you could supposedly walk deck to deck across the river sometimes. It was pure, raw commerce.
A total contrast to today's esplanades and bike paths. A huge shift from industry to amenity.
And New York's waterfront is unique, so long, so jagged, so varied. Its transformation wasn't one single project. It's been this ongoing process, different in different places. You had the decline, especially on the Lower West Side.
Crime, neglect.
Container ports moving elsewhere, plane travel replacing ships, culminating in that section of the West Side Highway literally collapsing in '73.
A pretty dramatic symbol of decay.
It really was. And the book mentions how those abandoned piers then became this sort of urban wilderness, places frequented by specific groups seeking privacy, like the gay community described in Edmund White's novels. A completely different kind of life taking over the derelict spaces.
But then came the rebuilding, the reclaiming, like historic Front Street.
Yeah, that's a fascinating example. Carefully restoring old buildings, but also integrating new ones. Try and tell that whole story of the city's relationship with the water, past and present.
And that plaque with the Moby Dick quote?
Circumambulate the city of a dreamy Sabbath afternoon. It perfectly captures that magnetic power of the sea, that pull the water has always had on the city. And despite everything, fires, downturns, decay that link endures.
It's fascinating how parks went from being an afterthought, relying on the rivers, to becoming essential, driven by the wealthy wanting London-style amenities, leading to Central Park.
Right.
And now that drive continues with things like Brooklyn Bridge Park, built on former industrial piers. The value of that waterfront land just keeps asserting itself.
It shows how cities evolve, how priorities shift. What was once purely industrial becomes a priceless public asset. That negotiation is always happening.
Let's turn to a more recent, very charged site, the World Trade Center. The book talks about the optimism as the new towers started rising.
Yeah, there was this definite sense of resilience, of moving forward, embodied in those rising structures. And the symbolism is everywhere, isn't it?
The height of one World Trade, 1776 feet.
Exactly. The starkness of the memorial pools, preserving the footprints, holding that grief, and then the soaring hopefulness of the transportation hub. The whole site uses this palette of steel, grays, reflective surfaces. It's constantly balancing memory and future.
A very tough balance. The book mentions the controversies around the 9/11 Memorial Museum, too. Its location underground, the inscription debates, the gift shop.
Oh, absolutely. Every single aspect was fraught with emotion and disagreement. How do you memorialize something like that appropriately? Who decides? What's included? What's left out? The designers had an incredibly difficult task.
They seem to have aimed for a factual testimonial approach, less about recreating the horror.
Right. Focusing on artifacts, personal stories, timelines, trying to inform and bear witness without being sensational or re-traumatizing people unnecessarily. A very careful line to walk.
And then there's Calatrava's Oculus, the transport hub, architectural daydream, the book calls it.
It is visually stunning. That white skeletal form reaching upwards, designed to bring light deep underground. The interior space is vast, almost like a modern pantheon.
With that wedge of light feature.
Yeah, aligning with the sun each September 11th at the time the second tower fell. It's a very poetic architectural gesture. Of course, the cost was hugely controversial.
Understandably.
But the argument made is about its long-term value. As a major transit hub, yes, but also as a significant public space for the city's future. A symbol of connection and maybe uplift.
Okay, looking up against skyscrapers, there's been a shift, hasn't there, from packing people in to building these super tall, super luxury towers for just a few residents.
That's a definite trend, and it kind of flips the old logic on its head, maximizing exclusivity rather than occupancy. These pencil towers are more like vertical mansions than traditional office or apartment buildings.
And that creates different demands aesthetically.
Totally. How does it look from the inside? How does it meet the street? What does it do to the skyline? Historically, there was often this sense that great buildings had a public responsibility. They contributed something to the city beyond their private function. That's being debated again with these new towers.
And the idea of mile-high skyscrapers, like Frank Lloyd Wright's dream, the book seems skeptical about the why.
Right. It suggests the drive is less about practicality and more about, well, just going big.
Yeah.
Pushing the limits because we can, like genetic testing or nuclear power. The technology might exist, but should we use it? How? Why?
And the prediction is?
That eventually some preposterously wealthy individual probably will build one, more as a monument to ego or ambition than anything else.
Let's bring it back to 42nd Street. Such a famous street, but with a real split personality, according to the book. Glitzy now, but historically sordid drear.
Definitely had that reputation for a long time, connecting ferry terminals, train stations, but also lined with less reputable entertainments. A bit gritty, a bit down at heel in parts.
But also, paradoxically, New York's most idealistic street.
Yes, that's the fascinating duality.
Yeah.
Because it's also where you find this incredible concentration of visionary institutions in architecture. The UN, Tudor City, the Daily News Building, Chrysler, Grand Central, the library, Times Square.
Even lost landmarks like the old Croton Reservoir where the library now stands.
Yeah.
Huge civic projects.
Exactly. Think about Bryant Park behind the library. It started as a potter's field, then a reservoir, then the site for the Crystal Palace for the 1853 World's Fair.
The Crystal Palace, that sounds grand.
It was meant to be. But reactions were mixed. People worried New York wasn't impressive enough compared to London or Paris, and others fretted about taverns and low life gathering around this symbol of progress. It perfectly captured that tension. High ambition versus street-level reality.
And look at Bryant Park today. Packed, vibrant, a total transformation.
It really is. And Grand Central nearby, just a masterpiece of merging private enterprise, the railroad's needs, with this incredibly generous public space, making even the daily commute feel grand.
Or the Daily News Building, conceived in a slightly less grand setting, apparently.
Yes, the story goes, it was dreamt up by its founders during World War I, possibly fueled by alcohol, amidst rather unpleasant conditions. But Raymond Hood's design was all about modern efficiency and harmony, form following function, creating this striking modernist icon.
So all these 42nd Street landmarks, they represent this blend of self-interest and public good, addressing city needs water, knowledge, transport, news.
In different ways, yes, they embody that characteristic New York fusion, but housing in that area initially was much more chaotic.
Before projects like Tudor City.
Right. Which brings us to Tudor City and how apartment living took hold. Fred F. French built Tudor City in the 1920s as a deliberate attempt to create this respectable, self-contained world, almost like a stage set.
An English village vibe, right on 42nd Street.
Exactly. Trying to push back against the area's rougher reputation and create a desirable enclave. It was part of a broader shift because people were initially quite resistant to apartment living.
Why is that?
Concerns about privacy, propriety, mixing with strangers. The whole idea felt a bit radical compared to a private house.
So how did buildings like the Chelsea or the Dakota change that?
They offered solutions. Co-op ownership gave residents more control. Features like grand entrances, private courtyards, lavish amenities made apartment living feel exclusive and secure, not communal and suspect. The Dakota especially projected this image of a fortress for the elite.
And then you had places like River House, even more exclusive.
Oh yeah. Gated court, private yacht landing, catering to the absolute top tier of wealth. A world away from the realities of most New Yorkers.
Including this in public housing. The book touches on that too, a much more complex picture than luxury towers.
Very complex. New York's public housing story is different from many cities where projects were often seen as failures and torn down. Here, despite major issues underfunding, decay, many complexes have survived, and residents often have incredibly strong community ties and fiercely protect their homes. It's not a simple narrative.
Let's jump to some specific neighborhood transformations. Soho, the artist takeover in the 70s. Classic story.
It really is. Artists saw potential in those big, cheap, empty industrial lofts. They moved in, created spaces, galleries followed, and suddenly you have this hip, desirable neighborhood.
Which then led to the loft law in '82.
Right, making it legal for people to actually live in those converted industrial buildings.
Yeah.
It sort of formalized the transformation that had already happened organically.
Then there's Sugar Hill in Harlem. A different kind of story.
Yes, a center for Black professionals, artists, intellectuals in the early to mid-20th century. A place of real aspiration and cultural significance within Harlem. Though the book notes it also had its own internal class dynamics, a kind of precarious elite status.
A stark contrast, though, to what happened later in the South Bronx.
Absolutely. The devastation there in the 70s and 80s, arson, abandonment, and neglect, became this powerful symbol of urban decay.
But there have been efforts to rebuild.
Definitely. Renovating landmarks like the Concourse Plaza Hotel, building the new Bronx County Courthouse, attempts to restore civic pride and function. But it's a long road.
And you find oddities, like the Andrew Friedman home.
Right. This grand palazzo in the middle of the Bronx, built as a retirement home for wealthy people who's lost their fortunes. A very specific, almost eccentric form of charity.
Architecture reflecting all sorts of social currents, even recent projects like David J. Sugar Hill housing, described as looking like a grim citadel.
It sparked debate, yeah. Designed as affordable housing, but its visual impact is quite severe, monumental. It shows how design intentions and public perception can diverge. Or Raphael Vignoli's Bronx Courthouse, trying to balance security needs with a feeling of openness.
It sounds like the memory of the Bronx's toughest times still hangs heavy.
It does. That fear of decline, of things falling apart again, it lingers. It's part of the city's collective psyche, perhaps.
Which brings us to this final idea, the city of memory and loss. That feeling of things constantly vanishing.
It's almost the price of living in such a dynamic place, isn't it? Familiar shops close, buildings come down, entire blocks get reimagined. There's an inherent melancholy to it sometimes.
Even Edgar Allan Poe felt it back in 1844, complaining about Brooklyn changing too fast, forgetting its past.
Exactly. It's not a new feeling. This cycle of erasure and rebuilding, decay and growth, it seems to be wired into New York's DNA.
So, summing up this whole deep dive, it feels like the key takeaway is this constant transformation. New York's physical self is never static.
Never. It's always being reshaped by money, by people, by technology, by huge events, economic forces, social movements, grand plans, accidents. They all leave their mark.
And the buildings, the streets, the parks, they're not just infrastructure. They're containers for all those stories, the dreams, the memories, the conflicts.
Precisely. The city wears its history, even as it rushes toward the future. Which leads us to maybe a final thought for you, the listener. How does this constant change, this layering of memory and loss, affect how you experience your city, wherever that may be? Think about the places around you that seem solid, permanent. Are they? Or are they just part of a longer story, a cycle of transformation you happen to be witnessing at one particular moment? What history is hidden just beneath the surface?
Looking at the familiar with fresh eyes. That's a great takeaway. Thanks for